I'm going to start with this image of a monolith that was generated by Midjourney version 5.2 that appeared as if from nowhere. It hadn't been in the prompt. The prompt was for a house, and suddenly I find this monolith generated, sitting exquisitely in the landscape. The music you will probably recognize, that I played, will probably recognize, is the music that began for 2001, A Space Odyssey, one of the most extraordinary movies of all time, and what has been voted as one of the most popular movies. The movie starts with a very enigmatic and curious scene with these primitive ancestors of human beings encountering this monolith. The monolith is something that has been sent by the firstborn, a tribe of super intelligent alien beings who install these monoliths as a kind of catalyst, as it were, to improving civilization. They are machines of some kind. Let's call them communication devices. And what we also see in this scene is these primitive ancestors of human beings inventing the tool for the first time, discovering they can use a bone to kill, and so on. This is often used as an example of when human beings first developed tools. And possibly AI itself might be the last tool that human beings develop. According to some theories, once human beings have designed a tool that itself can design other tools, that's the last invention that we need to make. 2001: A Space Odyssey was produced by Stanley Kubrick with the assistance of Arthur C. Clarke, who was a British futurist, scientist, and also someone who was predicting the future in an astonishing way. I want to play you a very brief commentary that he makes back in 1964, where he is predicting effectively the impact that AI will have when AI begins to think.
However, the most intelligent inhabitants of that future world won't be men or monkeys. They'll be machines, the remote descendants of today's computers. Now, the present-day electronic brains are complete morons, but this will not be true in another generation. They will start to think, and eventually they will completely outthink their makers. Is this depressing? I don't see why it should be. We superseded the Cro-Magnon and Neanderthal men, and we presume we're an improvement. I think we should regard it as a privilege to be stepping stones to higher things. I suspect that organic or biological evolution has about come to its end, and we are now at the beginning of inorganic or mechanical evolution, which will be thousands of times swifter.
That moment, it seems, has appeared. At least according to some commentators, AI has begun to think. And it's largely because of these kind of developments of ChatGPT and so on that we're experiencing this. For those working in the field, the astonishing capacities of ChatGPT have come as some surprise. There has been, in some sense, that everyone was aware of the potentiality of this field, but once it becomes so obvious through ChatGPT and other popular platforms, then I think the whole of the population begins to wake up to this. Opinions about AI are divided. There are those who support it unquestionably. There are those also who are resolutely opposed to AI. But there's also a third group, those who have been working in the field who are amazed by AI, but precisely because of how impressive, of how amazing it is, they are also slightly terrified. I belong to that group. I am both amazed by AI, but precisely for that reason, I am also somewhat terrified by AI. Nobody is more so dependent upon AI, was more so than Stephen Hawking, someone who depended upon AI to give him a voice. He was someone who depended on it at the same time, also warned us about the dangers of AI. We are at the most dangerous moment in the development of humanity. The rise of artificial intelligence is likely to extend job destruction deep into the middle classes, with only the most caring, creative, or supervisory roles remaining. So too Elon Musk. We need to be super cautious with AI, potentially more dangerous than nukes. And of course, Elon Musk in all of his industries depend upon AI. Tesla car, Neuralink, SpaceX, and his recently launched AI company. At the same time, he is warning us about AI. And so too Stuart Russell, another Brit, now working at University of California in Berkeley, and the co-author of the book on AI, has also written another book warning us about AI and the problem of control. He was also responsible for sponsoring a documentary, a movie about AI called Slaughterbox. And let me just play you some of the entry, some of the part of this movie.
Pilots directed almost 3,000 precision strikes last year. We're super proud of it. It allows you to separate the bad guys from the good. It's a big deal. But we have something much bigger. Your kids probably have one of these, right? Not quite. Its processor can react 100 times faster than a human. And just like your phones and social media apps, it does facial recognition. Inside here is 3 grams of shaped explosive. They can penetrate buildings, cars, trains, evade people, bullets, pretty much any countermeasure. Just characterize him, release the swarm, and rest easy.
You can see high windows, very small, precisely punctured to gain entry to the building.
A $25 million order now buys this. Enough to kill half a city.
Legislation would be useless against the so-called Slaughterbox.
Is to stay away from crowds.
We are thinking big. They cannot be stopped. When you can find your enemy using data, even by a hashtag, you can target an evil ideology right where it starts.
So let's be clear, there is nothing inherently evil about AI. It is simply a tool. And like any tool, it can be used for good or evil. I can use my kitchen knife to slice up my vegetables in the kitchen. I can also use it to murder someone. But so far, no kitchen knife has been convicted of any crime. It is a question of who uses it and for what purpose. And in the context of this last documentary about Slaughterbox, what Russell's trying to do is alert us to the danger of someone taking control of these things and using them. Surprisingly, in Ukraine in the recent conflict, we have not seen the use of Slaughterbox, which to me is a little bit surprising because Putin himself has once made the comment, whoever rules AI rules the world. We can be thankful that they haven't appeared in Ukraine. But the question of who is in charge is behind everything. In this very influential book, Shoshana Zuboff criticizes surveillance. And of course, AI can be used for surveillance. It can be used for very negative purposes. But to claim that it is inherently evil is to subscribe to technological determinism, to unequivocally and undialectically assume that only it can be used for evil. And yet we know in terms of surveillance that actually surveillance can be very positive. Back in several years ago, there was a famous case in the UK where an infant, Jamie Bulger, was abducted by 2 children. The only reason they caught these two children was because they were captured on CCTV outside a mother care shop in the UK. And we all use facial recognition for our phones and so on. We use it for our security. So surveillance itself is not inherently evil, but it can be used for very negative purposes by repressive regimes. If there is one area, perhaps among the critiques of AI that has perhaps become very important just recently, it has been the question of how copyright may be infringed through AI. I addressed this in my book, but it's become much more recently a concern for everyone. And in this particular series, we will have a session on copyright, which has become actually quite a murky area. There are some areas, some aspects of it that are very obviously copyright infringement. When copyright protected material is scraped from the web, that is clearly an infringement. But to what extent artists and writers can they sue for AI? We will for the copyright infringement. We will find out in a couple of sessions' time. So this really is the issue that I want to start off by addressing. Before I look into architecture itself, I want to look at the way in which more generally those within the profession are concerned about the sheer capabilities of AI, the astonishing capabilities of AI that has proved to be far more effective than anyone in the field had quite imagined. And we've seen many examples in the press. A letter signed by Elon Musk, along with other people, a letter that was promoted by the Future of Life organization from Max Tegmark and others, and which attracted the signatures of many others in the field itself. We find Geoffrey Hinton, the godfather of AI, quitting Google so that he can speak out against the dangers of AI. We find in the popular press how people are concerned about it, and Yoshua Bengio and Jan LeCun and others who work in the field alongside Geoffrey Hinton also voicing their concern. It is those who are working in the field who are experts that I think we should be listening to. I want to focus here on something that sounds distinctly unimpressive, distinctly uninteresting. Large language models. But I want to claim these are the issues. The term itself is an understatement. The language models we're talking about, these pre-trained language models, these such as GPT, generative pre-trained transformers, as it's known as, these are the things that really are the issue. And they are not just large, they are absolutely massive. Trained on trillions of data with trillions of parameters. These things are absolutely massive. And it's this that is causing the concern in some way, because they themselves are quite straightforward in terms of their code. There's only about 2,000 lines of code behind GPT, and it's only designed to actually predict the next word in the sentence. But somehow this system has started to develop some somewhat unnervingly capable characteristics. This led to the open letter from the Future of Life Institute, organized by Max Tegmark, calling for a pause in giant AI experiments. We call on all labs to immediately pause for at least 6 months the training of AI systems more powerful than GPT-4. And what they're referring to, what they're referring to here is the capabilities of these things. I want to just go focus on the second paragraph here. AI labs and independent experts should use this pause to jointly develop and implement a set of shared safety protocols for advanced AI design and development that are rigorously audited and overseen by independent outside experts. These protocols should ensure that systems adhering to them are safe beyond reasonable doubt. This does not mean a pause on AI development in general, merely a stepping back from the dangerous race to ever larger, unpredictable black box models with emergent capabilities. To be clear, black box refers to the fact these neural networks We know that they work, but we don't know exactly how they work. And there at the bottom is a reference to this term, emergent capabilities. Was this letter likely to work? Not really. It's like asking for the leaders in the Olympic marathon to slow down. So this, what will result, of course, was the competitors would catch up. And as Geoffrey Hinton comments, that doesn't work in capitalism. You simply cannot slow down your research because you'll be giving up your lead. But let me focus on the question of the emergent capabilities. The term emergent is something that's well known in the domain of science. John Holland, the first ever PhD in the world of computer science, the godfather of introducing biology into the world of computing. He was the one who developed genetic algorithms. And he was the one who also alerted us to the question of emergence. He was included in a book. Roland Snooks and I produced a book on swarm intelligence, architectures of multi-agent systems, where we interviewed John Holland. And the point that he makes, and I'm just going to show you a video of an example of what we can call emergence. This is the murmuration of starlings in Brighton, in England, in the evening, where these starlings come into roost in the evening. And what's happening here basically is a bottom-up emergent form of behavior. The flock of birds takes on a life of its own. All that's happening in this flock of birds is that each bird is following some very simple and straightforward instructions. Keep a certain distance from the birds on either side and the bird in front, go in broadly the same direction at roughly the same speed. And of course, those individual birds are not aware of the overall impression that this flock has from the outside. But what emerges from this is a form of behavior that is utterly unpredictable and is based on this multi-agent system. We can see it also in the stigmergic behavior of ants, or in the collective behavior of a slime mold, where thousands of individual cells come together into an individual body when foraging for food. It is an astonishing manifestation that we are only too familiar with, but with which science has yet to explain. Indeed, some forms of emergence have been described as strong emergence. And strong emergence, according to some commentators, resembles magic. Of course, magic itself does not exist. A magician does not perform magic. Rather, the magician performs a trick, deceiving the audience into thinking that what he or she is doing is actually magic, but actually hiding the straightforward mechanisms behind it. In other words, magic is simply a deception. And according to Arthur C. Clarke, or at least according to a quote attributed to Arthur C. Clarke, what we call magic is simply science that we have not yet explained. And this is the interesting aspect of emergence. Scientists from John Holland onwards have struggled to actually explain the phenomenon of emergence. We can see it, but we can't explain it. The flock takes on a life of its own. And this is what's happening with these large language models. They are learning. They have learned to write. They have learned to translate languages. They have learned to write code. And I would argue, they have learned to design. Here I want to introduce the person, probably the person most responsible for the huge advances in AI that we've seen in recent years, Geoffrey Hinton. He comes from a distinguished family in the UK. His great-grandfather was George Boole of Boolean geometry fame. And surprising for many, he actually signed up to study architecture at the University of Cambridge. He survived 2 days and then decided that architecture was not for him. He moved into studying natural science. Eventually, he started looking at AI. And because he was concerned about he was convinced that the way to really for AI to be effective was to model it on the human brain. He effectively was promoting what were known as neural networks. Now, in the 60s, neural networks were heavily out of favor. They had been trashed in a book by Marvin Minsky because they hadn't worked. From the very beginning, some had speculated that really that was the way forward and had produced some fairly primitive models of neural networks. But throughout the kind of the 60s, 70s, and 80s, all the way up to the millennium, these things were not working. But Hinton himself stubbornly persisted. He also refused to be part of the kind of AI research that was funded by the military and moved instead to Canada, where he set up at the University of Toronto an astonishing lab that included some of the luminaries in the world of AI, such as Yoshua Bengio and Yan LeCun, among those who studied under him. And at a certain point, however, Geoffrey Hinton was vindicated. As soon as GPUs, graphic processing units, had been invented and people realized their capacity to make computers much more powerful and much, much faster, all of a sudden, neural networks worked. And they worked in an incredibly effective way. We don't know why they work so well. All we know is that they work. Here then is Geoffrey Hinton talking about this question of AI and how it started to develop certain emerging capabilities. And he is convinced that AI is able to think, and it has a form of intelligence that is different to human intelligence, but nonetheless superior.
It made me realize that these digital intelligences have something we don't have that makes them much better. When one of them knows something, it can tell all the others. That's what we don't have with people. So imagine you had 10,000 people, and imagine if when one person learned something, everybody knew it. You could learn a lot more stuff, right?
Right.
And that's why things like ChatGPT knows like 10,000 times as much as any one person. It's because when you train it, there's lots of different copies looking at different bits of the data and learning stuff, and they can all combine what they learn instantly with a bandwidth of like trillions of bits.
So can they think?
Yes. So imagine the following scenario. I'm talking to chatbot, and we talk for a bit, and the answers it's giving me seem a bit strange to me, and I suddenly realize that it thinks I'm a teenage girl. And I say, what demographic do you think I am? And it says it thinks I'm a teenage girl. So the question is, when I said I suddenly realized it thinks I'm a teenage girl, was that a metaphorical use of the word think, or was that just the same way as we use think? And I strongly believe that use of the word think, when I said it thinks I'm a teenage girl, was exactly the same way of using think as we do with people.
And so that was enough to make you say, what, this has accelerated beyond my comfort level?
I suddenly realized maybe they already are better, and making them more like real neural nets isn't the point. They're already better than us. They're a better way of doing learning. And if we make them bigger, they'll get much smarter than us. They already know more than any one person.
I understand that things could go awry, but I still think that people hear the notion of danger and they dismiss it as hyperbole.
I thought it was hyperbole for a long time because I thought these things were a long way off. I thought there will eventually be danger, but I thought focusing on it now is unnecessary because it'll be 30 to 50 years before these things get more intelligent than us. But this combination of realizing that they might have a much better way of learning than we have, because they can share knowledge instantly, and seeing things like ChatGPT or Palm at Google that can explain why a joke is funny, made me realize these things are already pretty intelligent, and if they've got a better form of intelligence than ours, then it gets to be much more urgent.
So, just to be clear, the reference to the joke was basically, if Palm can explain a joke, it must be able to understand that joke. And this is really where we begin to sort of realize that some of the comments we made earlier on about AI, some of the commentaries that we made were maybe inaccurate. We did not believe that AI could think. AI does not possess consciousness, therefore we thought that it could not think. But it's becoming apparent that it can do certain things much better than we can, whether they're the same as human beings, whether the same kind of thinking, that AI can do the same kind of thinking as human beings, as Jeffrey Hinton would say. I'm not so sure about that, but certainly it's capable of some kind of cognitive capacity. It is able to understand in some senses, and I believe it has a form of intelligence in some senses, not the same intelligence as human intelligence, but superior to human intelligence. And this really is the concern. Let me also refer to Mo Gawdat, someone we're hoping to have on this show. Mo Gawdat is also also used to work for Google. He was a former chief financial officer and is the author of the book Scary Smart, where he conveys some of his concerns about AI. Let me play a short snippet of him where he contrasts AI or compares it to climate change. And for Gawdat, rightly or wrongly, he believes that AI is a greater threat than climate change.
I just don't want to call it a panic. It is beyond an emergency. It's the biggest thing we need to do today. It's bigger than climate change, believe it or not. It's bigger, but just if you just assume the speed of worsening of events, okay? Yeah, the likelihood of something incredibly disruptive happening within the next 2 years that can affect the entire planet is definitely larger with AI than it is with climate change. I just...
So here we have us using our personal monoliths, if you like, our personal communication devices. And it's here, basically, that AI has infiltrated our world. To be clear, AI consists simply of algorithms. If you want to understand AI, don't think humanoid robots. Think algorithms, think code, think programming. And as algorithms themselves are essentially invisible, we cannot see them. And this explains in some senses how AI has very stealthily managed to encroach in our lives, to find itself everywhere around us, even though we may not be aware of it. AI is what filters out our spam on our emails. AI is what finishes off our sentences on Gmail. AI is what translates languages on WeChat. AI is what recognizes our friends on Facebook. AI is what allows us to order an Uber. AI is what allows us to find the quickest way when we are in an Uber, and so on, and so on, and so on. AI is everywhere around us, but because it's invisible, we may not be aware of it. In my book, I make this comment: it is as though the Earth has been invaded by an invisible, superintelligent alien species. Now, interestingly, just in the past week or so, Yuval Harari has come up with very much the same impression. So let's hear Harari.
This is the end of human history, the end of human-dominated history. History will continue with somebody else in control. In 5 years, there'll be a technology that can make decisions independently and that can create new ideas independently. Maybe they'll be nice. Maybe they'll solve cancer and climate change, but we are not sure. I'm tending to think of it more in terms of really an alien invasion, an alien fleet of spaceships coming from planet Zircon or whatever, with highly intelligent beings. This is what we are facing, except that the aliens are not coming in spaceships from planet Zircon, they're coming from the laboratory. If the humans are divided among themselves and are in an arms race, then it becomes almost impossible to contain this alien intelligence.
I totally agree with him. And of course, I myself have adopted the term alien intelligence, which I'm not the first person, but it seems to me to precisely capture what we're talking about. Also in my writings elsewhere, I've called for what I term a second Copernican revolution. If Nicholas Copernicus had basically alerted us to the fact that the universe does not revolve around the Earth, but rather that the Earth revolves around the sun, so too we need to reconceptualize our position in the universe. We are no longer the center of intelligent life in the universe. There are other forms of intelligence that are there that are vastly superior to human intelligence, and we need to accept that fact. Another comment, in fact, an earlier comment that Yuval Harari makes is that AI has hacked the operating system of human civilization. It has understood language. And once you've understood language, you have enormous power because you can use language to persuade people to do various things. My contention is that AI has not only hacked the language.
All right, I'm going to bring up the table.
It has also hacked the design system, the aesthetic system of human beings, and that is to say, design itself. Let me just simply, and I won't show you many examples of this, but simply give you an illustration here. This is Midjourney version 5.2. We work with prompts. We write a prompt. And what happens is Midjourney uses a form of generative AI that generates an image based on that prompt. Now, these prompts are quite extensive. They have lots of references to lighting conditions, to the detail, to the rendering and so on, and they're maybe 70 or 80 words long. But the actual reference to architecture is extremely limited. In this particular prompt, I simply say, ultra-contemporary modernist house in the Austrian Alps. And Midjourney does the rest. It designs the building. It puts this rock in the foreground. It puts this bush in the background. It puts these mountains in the background and the valley and all the details in the valley and the clouds and so on. That is Midjourney. Midjourney effectively designed this scene. We can see that in other more straightforward examples. In this one, I asked for an ultra-contemporary modernist stainless steel kitchen, but I do not ask for anything else. Midjourney gives us this painting in the background, quite an interesting painting, I think. It gives us this bush in the background, whatever these things are outside, it gives us that. It gives us this coffee machine, it gives us this tap, it gives us lights, it gives us all these things, but I did not specify any of those in the prompt. They were all generated by Midjourney. And it also understands tectonics, the way in which materials come together. It has learnt how to design. And it has learned how to design, but not only that, it has the capacity to render it and to incorporate reflections of the sophistication of this particular image in a matter of 3 seconds. This would take any architect a long time to produce. And this is the remarkable but increasingly scary capability of these diffusion platforms, diffusion models, such as Midjourney, DALL-E, and so on. So I now want to turn to architecture itself and to offer some speculations or some thoughts about the potential impact of AI on the future of architecture. Now, we've already seen in Hollywood various industries coming alert to the dangers of AI. And just to kind of repeat, it's not AI itself that is the concern. It's the way in which human beings are using AI. There was another example in Los Angeles quite recently of a startup where the copywriter, the person who generated the text for advertisements and so on, was sacked. And the reason why he or she was sacked was simply because ChatGPT could do it better, more efficiently, and of course, much more cheaply. It wasn't AI that kicked this person out of a job. It was the CEO or someone within the company who realized they could save money by doing this. And the same applies to Hollywood, to the scriptwriters and the actors. Potentially, they are going to be losing their job because people recognize that they can use AI to replace them and thereby save on funds, save on money. And this is the point. Don't blame AI, blame the people using AI. A bad workman blames the tool, a bad theorist, I always maintain, blames the tools. And we get architectural commentators who are making these kind of naive statements that the argument that architects might be losing their job from AI is made by people who don't know much about AI. Well, I'm sorry, I follow those who do know about AI. I follow people like Jeffrey Hinton, Mo Gawdat, Max Tegmark, Yuval Harari, Elon Musk, Sam Altman, Mustafa Suleyman, and so on. These are the voices of authority who really know about AI. I haven't perhaps been watching so many movies, but I've been watching podcasts. I've been watching podcasts and I've been reading books. And there is a whole library of books that has been warning us about this. Martin Ford, who was a guest last week on this podcast, published this book, and it wasn't an obscure book. It was a New York Times bestseller. It won awards. The Rise of the Robots, Technology and the Threat of a Jobless Future. More recently, he's published The Rule of the Robots, How Artificial Intelligence Will Transform Everything. The books are out there. Or Daniel Susskind, co-author of a famous book about professions and technology, A World Without Work, Technology, Automation, and How We Should Respond. Or indeed, in US politics, Andrew Yang, it's automation, not immigrants taking jobs. He didn't succeed, but at least he put it on center stage, and Obama had already warned us about this. This is nothing new. It's not migrants coming across the border from Mexico that we should be worried about. It's automation that will take the jobs away. Architecture itself, of course, has been struggling. It's been struggling in recent years. And in fact, in 2015, Fashion Architecture, Taste, FAT, an architectural practice in the UK that had disbanded, came back together to edit an issue of the Architectural Journal in which they proclaimed the death of the architect. And to its credit, the RIBA itself, the Royal Institute of British Architects, was very much aware of these challenges. A few years before that, they commissioned a research study by the Building Futures Group, a group that I once belonged to, where they looked at the possibility of what impact would happen. And what they noticed was that architects were already losing control. More than 50% of all contracts were design-build contracts where the architect was working for the developer. In other words, the model that we had inherited from Alberti of the architect being in charge of everything had given way to a model where the architect was working for the developer. Moreover, certain practices were recognizing the necessity to diversify, to use these extraordinary skills that architects have, to think in three dimensions, to design, to understand materiality, very transferable and marketable skills, to use them in different domains, in industrial design, in product design, in the metaverse, and so on, and in interactive design. And in fact, one comment made was that the term architect was too limiting. In 10 years, we probably will not call ourselves an architectural practice, it will be something else entirely. So architecture is already in a form of crisis. And not only that, but throughout history, we've only been designing 5% of all the buildings that have been constructed. Quite where this figure comes from, I don't know, but this is the figure that is bandied around. The problem in some senses when it comes to AI is that we've all perceived that it would be robots that would be the first to have an impact. We're all familiar with these images of a Tesla factory where there are no human beings to be seen. And we've assumed that it's blue-collar workers, it is factory workers that will be the first to go. But what has become very clear with these huge advances in AI is that maybe it is the white-collar workers. In fact, robotics has not been proceeding quite as fast. A robotic arm will struggle to do some very simple tasks that an ordinary child will do. Put a pile of random blocks of Lego on a table and ask a robotic arm to sort them out and to build a wall, and it will struggle. Whereas AI will do things in an amazing way. Not only that, but to use robots requires a considerable financial investment. They cost money, whereas ChatGPT is almost entirely free. In other words, it is white-collar workers, not blue-collar workers, who are a threat. Often I've been telling my students, well, if you're worried about the future of architecture, just become computer scientists and work in the field of AI. But the problem is that computer scientists have realized that AI is capable of writing code, and they are also at threat. There was a study done in 2013 by two scholars from the University of Oxford about the future of employment and which professions were, as it were, most at risk from the threat of AI. And they listed out some 800 or so, 700 to 800 professions, and they analyzed them from recreational therapists right the way through to architects. And we can find architects, architectural engineers and managers who are only slightly less at risk than architects except landscape and naval. So architects are positioned at roughly around the 80th on a list that includes 700, of which telemarketeers have already disappeared. So this study somewhat confusingly presented architecture as being something, being a profession that was relatively immune. The creative industries were relatively immune from the threat of AI replacing human beings. The mistake that has been made by this, however, is the assumption that the comparison to be made is AI versus humans. That is completely wrong. In terms of AI, we are already talking about AI as a form of prosthetic, a form of extension, as it were, of the human mind. Extended intelligence rather than AI. And what we're seeing then is a coupling of human beings plus AI. The comparison to be made, therefore, is not AI versus humans, but a human being using AI versus human beings not using AI. Now, according to one comment I heard, one person using AI could achieve as much as 5 people not using AI. Is that true? Well, who knows? It depends really on what the task is, and indeed when, because AI is becoming increasingly capable. And it is proving to be extraordinary. But nonetheless, we have to anticipate that that is the situation. There is potentially, one could claim 80% unemployment from this. Who knows whether or not that is true? The other problem that has really not been addressed so far is what is likely to happen when AI becomes a tool that is used extensively in the workforce and when things get tough. I'm showing you an image of Shanghai, of Pudong in China, where already architecture has been suffering. And it's been suffering largely because of the kind of competition that's been going on there and the competition in terms of fees. Fees in architecture are based, normally anyway, on a percentage of the building cost. And of course, that depends on the type of work that's involved, the type of building and so on. But roughly, let's assume roughly that's approximately 5% over a ballpark figure. What's happened in China is that we're getting percentages as low as 1 or 2%. Now, if you think about it for a moment, there are only a certain number of buildings that are going to be built. In other words, there is only a certain amount of potential revenue coming in to the profession. Now, if you reduce the rate of the fees, you are reducing that revenue. So if we go from 5% to, let's say, just 2%, that means that effectively 40% of the revenue that comes into architecture is all we are left with. We have lost 60%. Of course, maybe there are other possibilities. Maybe there's a possibility of the metaverse stepping in, of other forms of employment, but we don't know for sure, and we can't guarantee that. This notion that somehow everything will be driven by economics is something that's put forward by the Suskins in their book about the professions. Technology will change everything, but the key driver of change is going to be economics. People are going to want to look for the cheaper solution, and that is what is going to cause all the change. Now, that doesn't apply to everyone. My contention would be that, for example, a practice like Zahedid architects, and of course, Patrik Schumacher has often said, look, we won't be affected. Well, he's absolutely right, in my opinion. His practice won't be affected, nor indeed will the other Starchitects, because the logic that governs Starchitects is quite a different logic. We can compare Zaha to a kind of designer label handbag, let's say, to Prada, to Gucci, to all of these kind of very expensive items. Now, the logic of these is a very different logic. It's not that you buy a Prada or a Gucci bag to save money, it's the opposite. You buy it to show that you don't care about money. It is a form of conspicuous consumption. So there will always be a market, in my view, for the Starchitects of the world. But the rest of us are likely to find life more difficult. I wrote about this for the zine. There'd been an article where someone said, no, AI is not going to have any impact on jobs. And I questioned this, how can you possibly say this? What is the basis of this? And I tried to point out some of the issues that need to be taken into account. What was interesting about the response to this is I got basically two camps. Those who are working in the field of AI said, yes, of course, we all knew this. In fact, one person even said, well, you haven't said anything new here. I think that was probably a bit of a wrong. I think I had some new things. But the point is, those working in AI accepted and believed that. There was also another camp who were not working in the field of AI who completely denied this. There was even one individual who made some comment something like, there's not a single AI on the market that could possibly match my ingenuity and my creativity. Well, that person is probably going to be the first to go. I want to argue this through two historical examples, or two thought models, shall we say, that show us, in some senses, the potential impact of AI in terms of competition with humans. And I want to start, first of all, with the world of gaming, in particular, the game of Go, and then I want to move on to the self-driving car. In 1997, before the famous match of Go, there was a match of chess, AI versus humans. Garry Kasparov, one of the greatest chess players of all time, and no one predicted that he would lose to IBM's Deep Blue, but lose he did. In fact, Ray Kurzweil, the futurist and author of a series of books on the future of AI, had predicted by 2000 that AI would beat the best human at chess, and it happened in 1997. Garry Kasparov eventually came away from this and said, we just have to understand that everything we know how to do, machines will eventually do better than us. Anything you can do, AI can do better. But the real test came in 2016 when AlphaGo of London, led by Demis Hassabis, took on Lee Sedol, one of the greatest Go players of all time. And the challenge of Go was far more considerable than the challenge of chess. Go is a relatively straightforward game in terms of the rules, but it is an infinitely complicated game in terms of the potential moves. There are more potential moves in Go than there are atoms in the universe. And this meant that in order to take on Go, DeepMind of London had to develop a system beyond the expert system that we used for the game of chess against Garry Kasparov. they had to develop a learning system using deep learning, using neural networks, using the systems that Geoffrey Hinton had basically bequeathed us. What was remarkable about this? Again, everybody thought that Lee Sedol, there was no way that he would lose to AI. And yet, gradually, over the course of five games, Lee Sedol himself began to realize the capabilities of AI. Yesterday, I was surprised, and this is Lee Sedol after game 2, but today I am speechless. And here he is referring to a particular move in game 2, move 37, which is one of the so-called slack moves that were made by AlphaGo in this match. Slack moves in the sense that nobody realized their significance until many moves later. In fact, they were often thought to be, in many cases, they were thought to be glitches, computer glitches, where the computer had gone wrong. And this particular move, move 37 in game 2, is the one that's gone down in history as possibly the most significant moment in the entire history of AI because of this. It was a move that was made on the 5th line of the board, a very unusual move because normally it's the 4th or the 3rd line, and the commentators thought that it was a computer glitch. But 100 moves later, this black stone and these two black stones began to eventually joined up, and AlphaGo won the match. But it was beyond our comprehension. Let me play you the comments of the commentators for this particular match.
From the Google team was talking about is this kind of evaluation value.
That's a very surprising move.
I thought it was a mistake.
But it was no mistake. One of the comments that Lee Sedol after the match made was, AlphaGo showed us that moves humans may have thought are creative were actually conventional. It's as though AI was operating at a level way beyond humans. But more to the point, I would say, is that it was doing things that we simply couldn't understand because it was operating at such a high level. It's as though there is a spectrum of intelligence, and it was operating off the scale in terms of human intelligence. It's a bit like with a dog. Dogs can hear or smell sounds and smells that are beyond our spectrum. We can't even detect them. AlphaGo AI can operate at that level, a level that we simply cannot understand. And what is interesting also is that we're discovering that in fact, we're seeing very similar things happening when AI has been applied to architecture. This is Howard Hoagland, the CEO of SpaceMaker that was bought up by Autodesk, is now known as Forma, where he makes this observation that AI was able to operate and to come up with solutions that a room full of architects would never have come up with themselves. It's coming up with these solutions, and they may not be, this might not appear to be a very progressive form of architecture, but it's the level at which AI is operating and the fact that it can come up with solutions that we can't do that is so significant. This applies especially, I think, to urban planning questions when the complexity of the situation is often beyond what humans can manage. Now, if AlphaGo was impressive, AlphaGo Zero, the next generation, was even more impressive. Not only did AlphaGo Zero beat AlphaGo 100 games to 0 when it took it on at Go, but there are other aspects about it that really gave us a forewarning of some of the things that are now happening with these large language models. AlphaGo taught itself to play Go without being told the rules of Go. It's just the same as these large language models teaching themselves a language or teaching themselves code without being actually specifically taught code. They can learn it on their own. But what is perhaps even more astonishing was the speed at which it was able to do these things. AlphaGo taught itself to play Go by playing AlphaGo Zero, taught itself to play Go by playing 4.9 million games of Go over 3 days. Now that seems like a lot, but when you think about it, it is really a lot. It amounts to 20 games of Go per second. Now, here I'm showing you a hummingbird. Admittedly, it's a slowed up video of a hummingbird. But the hummingbird is beating its wings in this video at roughly 3 times a second. Now imagine 7 times that speed. That is the speed at which AlphaGo Zero was playing goes against itself. It is simply beyond our comprehension. We could never compete with that level. And of course, as Jeffrey Hinton warned us, it is the speed of learning of AI that is also so disturbing. This is an image, a comment that I come back to over and over again. Nobody imagines AI to be capable as it is. Architects, people who are following chess, people who are following Go, no one expects AI to be so good. And Jack Ma falls into precisely that same trap. I never in my life say human beings will be controlled by machines. It's impossible. Human beings can never create another thing that is smarter than human beings. And Elon Musk responds, I very much disagree with that. The biggest mistake I see people making is to assume they're smart. People underestimate the capability of AI. They sort of think that it's like a smart human, but it's going to be much smarter than the smartest human being you will ever know. Already, ChatGPT knows 10,000 times more than any human being. What became of Lee Sedol? Well, in 2019, he gave up the game of Go on the basis of that AI was an entity, as he put it, that could not be defeated. Is this a presage for architects? The other model I want to refer to is the model of the self-driving car. And of course, at a very straightforward level, we can see direct comparisons in that if you have a self-driving car, you no longer need a driver. And if you have a form of AI that can completely autonomously design a building, then technically you would not need an architect. At least we can see that. But there is something more of interest here. If we follow the thinking of Toby Walsh, a British computational scientist working in Australia, who in his book Thinking Machines said, we won't be able to drive cars anymore and we will not notice or even care. So what does he mean by this? Walsh's thinking is this. First of all, self-driving cars will come along. They'll be very convenient. Maybe we're going out for a drink in the evening. We don't want to be driving under the influence, so therefore we take a self-driving car or whatever. And gradually, as we use these cars more and more, our own driving skills will start to disappear. It'll become more convenient. And increasingly, as a result of our driving skills beginning to disappear, insurance premiums for human drivers will go up. And of course, self-driving cars will become increasingly reliable. And eventually, at some point, it's so expensive to drive, we'll think, what the hell? And eventually, according to Toby Walsh, we will be banned from driving and we will not even notice or care. Is the same thing going to happen for architects? Now, what I would claim is that it's going to become very obvious that we are going to have to use AI. And professional indemnity insurance will not allow us to not use AI. In other words, if we don't use these tools, we are probably liable to have to pay extra. What has become very clear is that as cars get better, as AI gets better, they are outperforming and they are more reliable than human beings. This is an example, we're all familiar of early examples of when these self-driving cars would crash. And there were glitches, there were problems. But what becomes clear is that now the opposite is the case. And this was an example of where a human-driven car crashed into a Google self-driving car. Yuval Harari points towards this example and says, look, we need to recognize that there is potentially a problem. Human beings might have consciousness, but that itself could be a problem. We might be distracted. We might be distracted by seeing someone or by a message on our phone or something like that. A car is not distracted. A self-driving car will not be distracted, but human beings can be distracted. As such, consciousness is not necessarily such an asset. According to Yuval Harari, there are many routes to superintelligence, not all of them passing through the straits of consciousness. As far as corporations are concerned, the main concern is efficiency. Can it do its job? If my toaster can make good toast. I don't care if it's conscious or not. And frankly, although I hear a lot of people say, but what about all the feelings and emotions that I put into my design? Well, if it's not a good design, I'm sorry, but I'm not interested. So in the end, it's a rather brutal comment, but I don't think we need consciousness in order to design. What's become also more apparent is that clients are asking for AI to be used by architects. And this is a comment from Harvard Hookland from a few years ago. Already, clients were recognizing that AI was useful for two particular reasons. Firstly, of course, that it's more reliable than human beings. AI does not make mistakes, and that's why we use spell check, right? But also because developers realized they could get far greater return on their investment through your AI, and they could have buildings which, using digital twins, would perform better in terms of environmental performance and so on. I put this question to ChatGPT. What would the impact of AI be on the future of architecture? And this is what it generated. In the near future, architects may become a thing of the past. AI is quickly advancing to the point where it can generate the design of a building completely autonomously. This could spell the end of the profession as we know it, raising questions of what the future holds for architects in a world of AI-generated buildings. Architects who choose to ignore AI will be left behind and ultimately forgotten as the industry evolves and advances. Therefore, it is imperative that architects pay attention to AI and its potential to revolutionize the architecture, or they risk sleepwalking into oblivion. And the common comment that's often made is that architects who use AI will replace those who don't use AI. But I want to just stress the whole question about the architect and the name of the architect and the licensing of the architect and how this might be impacted by the world of AI. And refer in particular to the kind of work that was coming out of the RIBA, where they began to realize the potential impact of this on the profession. In fact, they were very much aware of the work of the Suskins, two British writers, Richard and Daniel Susskind, who back in 2016 wrote another best-selling book on the future of the professions. And their comment, how technology will transform the work of human experts. And their comment is that basically the professions as we have them, the gentleman's agreement or the social contract or what they call the grand bargain that allows architects to police architecture, that allows engineers to police engineering and doctors to police medicine and so on, that itself is likely to collapse. When push comes to shove, then eventually the driver of change, as I mentioned before, is likely to become economics. And I want to, by comparison, I want to sort of point out here that what we're seeing now, we're seeing the work of XCool, LookX, is that there is a potential, effectively, for AI to do everything. Already, LookX has been invited to judge competitions using AI. If you can judge competitions using AI, of course, you can enter competitions using AI. And we've already seen that they have beaten MVRDV, Snøhetta, and other series of quite prominent firms in their practice by using AI. But what it also begins to suggest is the possibility that we can produce a platform, and this is, in fact, the work the early formation, shall we say, of this platform from LookX, whereby AI will do things that respond to all these considerations. They respond to all the building codes, to all the local planning requirements. They are keeping track of costs. They are effectively offering solutions that have embedded into them structural performance criteria, environmental performance criteria, acoustic performance criteria, and all this. So that effectively it becomes almost like a kind of spell check writ large, where we cannot do anything that doesn't conform in some senses to these constraints. In other words, what's happening is we're relying less on the name of the architect or the licensing or the registration of the architects and more on the data itself. In fact, one could imagine that if this was really working properly, you wouldn't even need to submit a planning proposal. It would already be evaluated by the system itself. Now let's think about this in the context of the taxi. Of course, the London taxi, the black cab, has had a difficult time in recent years, not only has the GPS allowed for the possibility of navigation. And to be clear, one of the ways in which you became a taxi driver was to pass a test about your knowledge of the streets of London. You could not become a taxi driver, a black cab driver, unless you passed this test. But once you had a GPS system, you didn't need to know all that. But then, of course, something else came along, Uber, which immediately was a challenge to the taxi industry. And what's interesting is that not everyone has accepted Uber. It's deemed unfair competition in certain countries. And this is a map of places where Uber faces either partial or full bans. That at least was the map at a certain stage, but increasingly I see, it appears, Uber is being allowed to get back into the market. Uber secures London license for another 2.5 years. That was from last year. And the view of the LSE is that Uber should be regulated and not banned. The point being, all those mechanisms for controlling the profession of being a taxi driver in London have dissolved because there's no longer any requirement for this. And if the data itself, if the building proposal itself can be evaluated by AI, why do we need an architect coming along and say, I am an architect and I'm qualified to talk about these things? It'll be all down to the data. This again is what ChatGPT said in relation to the future of the profession and the future of licensure. The emergence of artificial intelligence is set to revolutionize the field of architecture, challenging traditional notions of licensure and expertise. With AI's ability to analyze vast amounts of data, generate complex designs, and optimize building performance, it's no surprise that some are questioning the need for architects to be licensed. As AI becomes more sophisticated, it will undoubtedly continue to disrupt the architecture profession, leading to a future where the role of licensed architects may be drastically reduced, if not altogether eliminated. The question now is not whether AI will have an impact on the architecture industry, but rather how architects can adapt and integrate this technology into their work to stay relevant in a changing landscape. And this is my conclusion. What architects need to design right now is not another building, but the very future of their profession, the very future of our profession. Let me finally just add a little bit comment on an education, which seems to me that education is really at the front line. Education at the front line because we are training architects to go into a profession in which the singularity or the moment of change, whatever we're going to call it, is going to happen very soon, sooner than we anticipated. Now, here we have the Architectural Association in London, and possibly the elite organizations will do better than those who are less famous, who will probably struggle in some way. But let's start off with a very straightforward question. If we do not need so many architects, will we need so many students? And if the number of architects is going to be reduced to 40% because of fees and so on and so on and so on, does that mean that we're going to have 40% of the students? And secondly, if these tools are going to be so effective in doing much of the work for us, do we need 5 years to study architecture, or could we not do it in 3 years? In other words, if you have only 40% of the architects and then you reduce it down to just 3 years, you've got even fewer professors being required. And indeed, when you've got a ChatGPT there to give you advice, who needs a professor? Of course, the response to some of these things has been to basically ban chatbots and so on from the classroom. This kind of reminds me of the situation not so long ago when calculators, pocket calculators, were banned from maths exam. Well, this seems to be kind of pointless in some senses, in the sense there have been algorithms that have been produced where you can detect whether something's been produced by ChatGPT, but at the same time, there'll be other algorithms that have been produced to camouflage that. And there are going to be other platforms, other models that are going to be producing generative AI. It is going to be impossible to police. And my argument would be is we have to accept this. We have to work with this. In fact, on one of the courses that I'm teaching, I ask my students not to write an essay anymore, because any student can write the perfect essay, but rather to harness the capabilities of AI in as many ways as possible to produce some kind of video of them, where they are really exploring the potentiality of AI, and that seems to me to be the way forward. But there is another problem that's not associated with AI at all, and that is the fact that education has continued in a model that pretty much the same model for many years. Here we have a typical classroom. It's probably not an architectural classroom, but nonetheless, this is what we see. A professor talking to a small group of students. Now, the standard model that we have of the architect, as it were, this kind of provider of information, of discouraging all that he or she knows and informing the students, is already obsolete. If we follow the arguments of Sanjay Sama from MIT, the head of open learning, there is more on YouTube than any professor can possibly inform you about. In other words, we have to shift the notion of the professor from being a content provider to be, as Areti Makopoulou of IAC says, to being a curiosity stimulator. Furthermore, in the world of AI, things are shifting so quickly that it's impossible for any one professor to be able to deal with these things, unless perhaps it may be some professor at MIT. Very few individuals in the world are qualified to keep pace with this. This is precisely why the doctoral consortium itself has been set up, partly because we can, instead of having individual professors in small groups and in individual classrooms, we can share one platform whereby we can share information across the planet and break through all the boundaries, all the social, economic, and political boundaries or barriers that have prevented people from getting access to education. But it makes particular sense for AI, where there are only a handful or so of individuals, such as Arturo Tedeschi, who gave this tutorial on connecting ChatGPT with AI, that really know how to do it. So this surely is the way forward. This then was ChatGPT on the future of architectural education. With the emergence of AI-powered design tools and techniques, the need for traditional architectural education is rapidly diminishing, and it is not inconceivable that it may disappear entirely. As AI algorithms become more sophisticated and capable of performing complex tasks, they can automate the entire design process from conceptualization to construction. This means that architects may no longer need to spend years honing their craft through rigorous education and training. As AI technology continues to advance, architects may become a relic of the past, replaced by intelligent machines that can design and build structures with greater efficiency and precision than humans ever could. Who knows whether this is going to be true or not? Let me finally finish with a comment going back to the title itself. And I want to refer here to an article that came out this week that I wrote. It came out with parametric architecture, alien intelligence. Is it time to panic? And I want to refer here to another Brit who was responsible for an important movie, Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, Douglas Adams, this incredibly influential book, movie series, television show, and so on, that appeared when I was a student myself, and has such an impact on the world of those working in the world of technology. Those who know the movie will recall that there is a massive supercomputer that is called Deep Thought, and it's employed to give the answer to life, the universe, and everything. Now, this potentially is, I think, what AI can do. If it is hacked into our operating system of language, if it is hacked into our operating system, our visual operating system of design, if it can understand language, if it can understand code, potentially it can understand, as it were, the genome of human culture, the answer to life, the universe, and everything. As we all know from the movie, this Deep Thought, this supercomputer, comes up somewhat frustratingly with the answer 42. And then they discover that really it's a question of asking the right question. This is why, for Elon Musk, this book is so important. It is, for him, a book about philosophy. In order to get the right answer, you have to ask the right question. But the point I want to make right now is that it took 10 million years for deep thought to come up with the answer of life, the universe, and everything. With ChatGPT or the GPT series or those in the future, what's likely to happen is it's not going to take 10 million years. It's going to take 3 seconds. Is it time to panic? On the back cover of the book, The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, there is this comment, don't panic. I want to return to Arthur C. Clarke for some reassuring British advice on this.
However, the most intelligent inhabitants of that future world won't be men or monkeys. They'll be machines, the remote descendants of today's computers. Now, the present-day electronic brains are complete morons, but this will not be true in another generation. They will start to think, and eventually they will completely outthink their makers. Is this depressing? I don't see why it should be. We superseded the Cro-Magnon and Neanderthal men, and we presume we're an improvement. I think we should regard it as a privilege to be stepping stones to higher things. I suspect that organic or biological evolution has about come to its end, and we are now at the beginning of inorganic or mechanical evolution, which will be thousands of times swifter.
So let me leave you with that reassuring viewpoint. Should we panic? Should we be disturbed by AI? Should we see it as amazing and offering huge possibilities for the human race, or should we see it as challenging? I'm going to finish perhaps with a very British comment based on Arthur C. Clarke's comment: keep calm and carry on. Okay, my apologies, that took a little long time, but I wanted to lay things out. So we will now be open to some questions. We have a Zoom audience here. We also have a YouTube audience that's following the live stream. Those on the YouTube audience might like to put their questions in the chat there, and we can check them. And anyone from the Zoom audience will be most welcome to ask some questions. Maybe I should just stress it that, I think we don't know what's going to happen. We really do not know what's going to happen. There is nothing we know for certain except everything is uncertain. Therefore, all we can do is speculate. And we can speculate and ask questions. But one thing we cannot do is state categorically that this technology is going to have these kind of impacts. We can observe, and we can do our research, and we can offer informed opinions on this. So let me finish at that point and stop sharing my screen. Any questions?
Well, thank you, Neil. That was a wonderful and very, very inspiring talk. I mean, I thought maybe Eric, if Eric is here, because he had a question in the chat, maybe Eric, do you want to ask your question right now, or we can read it if you're not here?
Hi there. Yeah, I can read it. I was asking.
Or, I mean,
it's there, but I was interested in this question of alien intelligence quite much, and it seems to be not the aliens in the sense of sci-fi or not, but rather the otherness, that which we cannot attain or even know its irreversible effects. So that otherness, the thing that's out of our capacity to understand or even withstand. And I was asking then if it's evolving, if alien intelligence then evolves further than forecasts, say beyond this idea that it's some sort of prosthetic that we can control and therefore obtain some sort of aesthetic results. Would you think that perhaps a need for a counterintelligence in the sense of, Cold War counterintelligence too may arise And this is not just talking about architecture, design, art, or any of those, or science even, but rather just plain survival of what we're doing to with it to ourselves. And if so, what form or what organizational tactical capacities shall this counter alien intelligence assume in order to subsume it, or at least challenge the possibility of its misappropriation? Even though the last part be, how do we stop ourselves from stepping on ourselves, which is difficult, but yeah.
Mm-hmm. That's a very good question. I mean, first of all, let me tell you that there have been a series of predictions, especially by Ray Kurzweil, about what's going to happen in the future. And last week's guest, basically, he actually did a survey of different views about when would this happen and what. And there are a number of, they ranged from Rodney Brooks, who's the famous roboticist from RMIT, Australian roboticist, who said, this is not going to happen till the end of next century, to others who are less, who are maybe more cautious. And I think what's happened now is that, and you saw this with the comments that were coming in from Jeffrey Hinton, that it's happening quicker than we thought. It's happening much quicker than we thought. And this is what surprised everybody. Hinton said, I thought there would be cause for alarm in the future, but it's happening quicker than that. So this is the real issue, is the question of time. We're dealing with Moore's law, first of all, where things go exponentially quicker, not just 1, 2, 3, 4, but 1, 2, 4, 8. They speed up. But they're speeding up, and we're discovering, as in fact Hinton's commenting on, the capacity to learn. These things learn all together. That's really the kind of problem in some senses, that we just cannot keep pace with these things. But in terms of countermeasures, well, I think one of the interesting things is what you cannot predict. You can develop a tool. You cannot predict how that tool is going to be used. I mean, let's take the ordinary, iPhone, for example. The mobile phone was not intended to be for popular use. It was meant to be for a rich businessman. But it was a certain sort of moment when the rich businessmen gave that tool to their daughters going out in the evening and said, give us a call and I'll come and pick you up later on, that suddenly it opened up a new social dimension and it became more popular. And with the popularity, the cost came down and so on. Now, nobody had predicted that then you could use this tool in different ways. Like, for example, there was an amazing article in the AD that I edited on digital cities. All the architects were talking about, the forms of the future city is going to look like this. Patrik was talking about parametricism and so on and so on and so on. Ben Bratton wrote an essay called The iPhone City, where he said, this device is already changing how we negotiate and operate in the city. And he speculated how it could become, your office could become mobile. In your car, you could do all your work and so on. Well, you can't text while you're driving these days, but nonetheless, he wrote this, that the car could become a form of employment 1 year before Uber took off. Now, what's going to happen, basically, is there are going to be some inventive forms of use, some of which are probably going to make forms of employment happen, just like Uber. Now, we can't predict what they are, but almost certainly there will be some positive outcomes about this. And I also think that one of the positive outcomes is the fact that architects who have been beholden to developers so far could even take over the role of the developer. You could use AI as a kind of safeguard that not only would give you instructions, how do you become a developer, just ask ChatGPT, but it kind of safeguard. I think what the role of AI in the future is going to be like a spell check writ large. It will check everything, our text. It'll fact check these things and so on. And I think that'll make those possible. But you're absolutely right. There could well be some counter forms of intelligence. And I think this kind of question of this resistance goes almost with this kind of, let's say, the question about surveillance. Surveillance is bad, right? Big Brother. Well, as soon as Big Brother becomes a TV show where you're not worried about being watched, but you're playing to the cameras, you start evolving other tactics. So you think you're spot on there, Eric. I'm not quite sure what those forms of resistance will be, but absolutely for sure there will be resistance. I believe that, yeah. Okay, so we've got another couple of questions here. Benki Studio. Elon Musk should be quoted with a grain of salt. Social media has been doing its damage for more than 100 years. Very few of us rang the alarm. Well, I don't know. All you can do is quote people. I mean, that's all you've got to go on. I think it's significant. I mean, I think what happened actually, apparently, it was when this book by Nick Bostrom, Superintelligence, was being read in Silicon Valley that everyone started getting alarmed about these things. I don't know. I mean, I'm just simply quoting him, and I don't know whether he's right or not. I'm just simply quoting him. Let me move to Dimitri. There is a general. Hold on a second. Dimitri, do you want to ask your question? Maybe you can just ask it.
Dear Neil, it was a pleasure to hear the speech, and it was very inspiring. And my question is like, because we have this exponential growth of the of the progress right now, and the situation changed so fast, do we need to analyze right now of what is in the production line? For example, the Midjourney producing a lot of content, and it's actually changing our perception of the understanding of what the design is, of what the architecture is. And we need some kind of analyzation, theory or something saying about this moment at present, or we just kind of coming up to the new kind of goal which is coming and in the near future.
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think we've got two types of people who are significant now. One are the technologists, the ones who are developing the tools themselves. But there are also people like Yuval Harari. Yuval Harari is a historian. He's an historian, a very intelligent historian, and he's very open-minded. He's looking to the future more than the past. But he is an historian. Sometimes you need to step away from the coalface. If you're working on something so immediately, you can't see things in a certain sort of way. And I think, therefore, these people have a really important role to do in being able to kind of see it from a distance and conceptualize the overall view. I mean, just personally, when I was working on Alberti, I was working with the language itself, translating Alberti. And someone asked me to give a lecture at the AA on Alberti. I said, I can't do that. I knew every word in Alberti, but I couldn't comment. You need a certain distance. And I think there's a really important role for public intellectuals like Yuval Harari, Slavoj Žižek, and so on to come in and talk about these things. But what I would also say is that there is something else that is happening that we don't know about. This is not because it's any subterfuge or it's secret. Well, it is secret to some extent. And that is to say, the tools that are being developed. Now, we don't know about these tools because they're under non-disclosure agreements and so on. Because of competition, nobody wants to disclose quite what they're working on. I have some inkling because I knew her because she's a candidate on the Doctor of Design program at FIU. I know her and I know broadly what they're working on. And I can say that is going to be significant, not Midjourney, not these things. Amazing as they are, it's going to be those tools that are completely going to revolutionize the entire pipeline of production in the architectural office. But if there is something that we can get from Midjourney, is the glimpse of the capability. Now, if Midjourney, it's entirely superficial. It's just 2D images, but at the same time, it blows my mind. It absolutely blows my mind. Now, that gives us a hint about what these other tools are going to be able to do. And at least I think so. The whole process of being an architect, I know when I was working in an architectural office, right? I'm a licensed architect. The kind of tedious tasks we were doing, I went straight from studying at Cambridge, well, after my Alberti translation, into working in an office where I was working on toilets and door details, which were just a repetition of what that practice had done in the past. Clearly, the architect profession is going to be ripe for that, but quite what AI is going to produce, only time will tell. I just think it's an extraordinary thing. We need to be alert to it. Well, I would say also, since you're based in Shanghai, is I think one of the most important things is the way in which AI is going to be used in the future in terms of digital twins. In other words, while we've been focusing on form, its information is going to be an important thing. Who cares what the city of the future is going to look like? I think it's going to look much like the city of today. There'll be a few buildings, but what is going to be transformed is the way in which we use it. So I often use the example of an Uber car. Does an Uber car look different to an ordinary car? No, because it is an ordinary car. It's the way in which it's being processed. So information is going to be the way that cities are controlled. And in China, they have this company, it's called CityBrain, which is already using AI as a digital twin to control the traffic. So a digital twin is when you have a real-time feedback from the actual physical world into an AI system, and that's thinking, as it were, for you, and it's providing this feedback. We're also seeing buildings which are being monitored by these devices, so that we can improve the performance of a environmental performance of a building. And also, according to Mustafa Suleyman, we're going to have these personal digital twins for us personally, individually, in a few years' time as a kind of a consulting device or something like that. So, I think these technologies are going to have a huge impact, but who knows how they're going to work. But that was a good question. Maybe you can move on to Vasco. No, Vasco's also on the Zoom chat. Vasco, can you comment, or do you have a?
Yeah, but I have lots of sound around me. That's why I have read.
Okay. Okay. Well, it's okay. It's quiet now. So just a sec. Okay. Okay. Do you want me to read it? Shall I read it? Okay.
Yeah. Of course.
Okay.
Please
okay. So Vasco is in Dhaka in Bangladesh, which is a very noisy city. I know from having been there. Can AI truly understand and replicate the nuances of cultural and historical architectural styles? Who owns the data generated by AI systems in architectural design, and how is it controlled and used? I mean, there are two questions there. And I think also I would say that, maybe not just architectural styles, but anything. Can AI truly understand and replicate the nuances of cultural and historical? Well, first of all, I think that term "understand" is something that, this going back to what Geoffrey Hinton was saying, depends what you mean. I mean, if you say, can it truly understand? Has it got true intelligence? Can it truly think? There's a danger that we're just judging it from a human-centric point of view. We're comparing it to that. And I think we get Jeff Hawkins, who is an incredible scholar, a really interesting person who appeared on our doctoral consortium a while back, was saying, no, AI can't think. It's nowhere near as good as human beings. Well, that's one particular viewpoint, but Geoffrey Hinton has a different viewpoint. And I think if we change our perspective, we don't judge it in human terms, but actually judge, if AI was to judge us in AI terms, it would think of us as being particularly stupid and particularly slow. Think of a creature, a household pet, or an ant, or whatever it is, and take that perspective. It's going to look down on us. So it is going to be superior. I think that we need to use inverted commas. So when we say think, can we use understand? Can we use intelligence? That's, I don't think they're the same. But at the same time, I think what it's beginning to also show us is maybe we don't operate in quite the sophisticated way that we imagine. There's a book, for example, by Stephen Wolfram, who writes about ChatGPT, and he said, if ChatGPT is able to produce these intelligent sentences based on a simple principle, predict the next word in the sentence, and just be clear, that's what it does. The Google system actually predicts a missing word in the sentence, but the OpenAI system, the next word in the system. If we can get from that to writing this text, doesn't this presuppose that maybe human language is not as complex as we thought? And I think this is the interesting question for me, is to what extent AI can be a mirror in which we can think about how humans operate. Not necessarily saying we're the same, but also use it to contrast it in some ways. And I think that is the tantalizing aspect of it. And that's why I think that the world of neuroscience, which is especially the kind of computational neuroscientists like Anil Seth, is so fascinating. These two worlds are coming together. And effectively, what we're learning is what it is to be human. And I think that is the real sort of question. So anyway, but I think that we have to be very cautious about how we use these things. The question of who owns the data generated by AI systems in architectural design and how is it controlled and used? This is a very, very, very complicated question. We're going to have a session on copyright in 2 weeks' time. And as I've already recorded a pre-recording, I know what the answers are. And I would simply say that it is extremely murky. There are basically 2 points I'd make. One is that there is an obvious infringement when copyrighted material is scraped from the internet. But when it comes to more generally how we use things. That's not so obvious. I think that, for example, when you think about how collage operates, you can take bits of other people's artwork and make a collage, and that's okay, right? I think the way that we absorb information and re-articulate it, actually, frankly, human beings do this the whole time. This is a comment that's made by Adorno, that humans become humans by imitating other human beings. We ourselves, frankly, as architects, we are copying other people. There's like a canon of architecture, right? This is what you can do. And you can you've got to loosely follow what Zaha does, or Rem Koolhaas, or Herzog and de Meuron, but not do the same, but you've got to kind of loosely follow them. And that's the logic of this. And the other comment I'd make is even those people who really change the rules, who come up with completely different ways of approaching things, like, say, Frank Gehry. I think the Guggenheim in Bilbao was an amazing building for many different reasons. It helped transform Bilbao, but it was really, it broke with tradition and gave a new form of architecture. But what we get Frank Gehry replicating the same, copying himself effectively in a building like the Walt Disney Concert Hall in LA. So I don't think that human beings are as original as we like to think we are. But the question of copyright is a really interesting question. I think the second point I would make, and this we will talk about this in 2 weeks' time, is that actually it is almost impossible to sue for copyright, especially in the States. It basically involves a 6-figure sum, first of all, and more, that's the minimum, to sue. And secondly, it takes years to go about this. So the idea that people are, I'm going to sue, forget it. It may not be so straightforward. So I don't know, it's a complicated question. I think it's very murky territory. The world of copyright is something that changes from country to country. I actually wrote about it in my first book of AI, not for that reason. I was interested in this particular painting that was generated by AI. Who produced it? Was it the person who wrote the code? Was it the person who put together the painting, or whatever? And it's clear that copyright was going to be an issue, but now it's become central. We will find out. I think the court systems are just catching up, but for sure the legal scholars here are really saying, well, hold on a second, it's not so straightforward. So so that's also a difficult question. I don't know. I think what is so fascinating is the questions that AI is throwing up and challenging us with. Genzilio, who's also here on Zoom, do you want to maybe ask your question, or I can read it out if you want?
Okay, yeah.
Yeah. Do you want to, shall I read it out, or you want to read it?
Sorry?
Do you want to read it out, or shall I?
I don't have a camera, so you maybe.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Oh, yeah.
So, greetings to Shanghai. In the field of architecture, does AI really change the design process and the appearance of buildings? Will this lead to more standardized rather than increased diversity? Just like anyone uses AI to learn Zaha and Gehry design logic, everyone can design buildings to mimic their style. Will it actually lose the independent characteristics of design? Well, there's several questions there. Okay, let me just try and I think it does change the design process. There are many ways you can think about AI, but just looking at, say, Midjourney, one of the comments I think I personally you can see it already in photography, right? The way in which the use of digital cameras changed the way we take a photograph. In the old days, we would set up this one perfect shot. Maybe you'd take a Polaroid photograph to make sure it's right. You would take that shot, then you would develop it, a few days later, and that would be it, right? But now we just take a random sample of images, and then we choose the best one, and then we maybe edit it, enhance it, and so on. In other words, we're talking more about a search process than a strict design process. We're talking also more about a kind of where the term even design itself becomes a term that needs to be renegotiated. Are we talking about designs, or are we talking about outcomes? And I think especially in the context of AI, where the relationship with, let's say, Midjourney is not so clear. What do we say? Did you say I designed it? Or I personally say, this is an outcome I generated using Midjourney. So automatically, we've got a different vocabulary. that speaks of a different process. Will this lead to more standardized rather than increased diversities? That's an interesting question. I think that, first of all, one of the challenges, certainly when you're using Midjourney, and of course, let's accept that Midjourney is just a very superficial thing and there's more to come, but just focusing on Midjourney, one of the challenges are that there are, in some ways, there are limitations. You know, if you wanted to refer to an architect, first of all, you've got to find an architect with an unusual name. I mean, a name like John Smith, which is a very popular name in the West, wouldn't work because there are thousands and thousands of John Smiths. Secondly, it's got to be someone who's got a lot of data on the out there in social media that we can draw upon. So someone like Zaha Hadid is perfect, well-known, unusual name, she's out there. And likewise, Björk Ingels, also unusual name out there. So already we're realizing it's limiting those we can refer to. There's also something I would say that, you know, is to do with the what we call affordances of the tool itself. In other words, you can use AI very effectively to do certain things. It's not that it has agency, it just has limitations. It doesn't know agency, we're in charge. But for example, inflatables and puffer jackets are really easy to do. So that you find on Instagram, we're inundated with images of inflatables and in puffer jackets and so on, because you can do that. But some things it can't do. I found that it was very good at looking at Mies van der Rohe's Barcelona Pavilion. Not that it ever replicated, it never replicated the exact example. We got variations on a theme, but I tried this in the Opera House and it just didn't work. So effectively, I think, okay, forget that. I'm going to go in this particular direction. So it does, you are limited in some respects. The other thought that I had, though, is that you potentially can introduce diversity, because what you can do is breed different things. And what I did a series where I was using orchids, and you can breed orchids with, I don't know, Zaha or something like that, and you can get a very unusual range. So instead of simply interpolating within a kind of given data set, you can crossbreed different data sets and get variations that you could never have imagined. So that's been my view. Then the next question is, just like everyone uses AI to learn Zaha and Gary's design logic, everyone can design buildings to mimic their style. Yes, yeah, there's clearly going to be more and more Zaha on the internet. That again, it's going to feed into itself in a feedback loop, and it's going to be become exacerbated. So that's almost certainly true. Will it actually lose the independent characteristics of the design? It will change the notion of design. Yeah, I'm not sure what I can sort of say. To the point where maybe you can't even use the word design anymore. Aidan Ackerman, do you want to ask your question, Aidan, or I don't know how your connection is? Well, let me simply ask Aidan's question. I know that he was popping in and out of connection. Aidan, let me read it for you. What do you think?
No, I'm here. Apologies. I keep getting a drop connection. Can you hear me okay?
Yes. Yeah.
I was just thinking of the idea of winners and losers. Are there people who will learn to exploit this? And you've spoken to this a little bit even since I posted the question, but in ways that instead of being sort of just susceptible to AI, that we might find uses we haven't thought of, and practitioners who really figure out how to use it to accelerate their leadership as opposed to sort of fall behind or become redundant.
Yeah, I mean, it's difficult to say, except I would say that the winners are the ones who are going to be engaging with it and exploiting those possibilities, and the losers are going to be the ones who don't do this. I mean, all I would say is basically, when I was a student at Cambridge, there was we were banned from using computers in the studio. There was one professor who thought that they were, they limited creativity and things, and we were not allowed to use them. Now, what happened basically out of that was that, you know, the smart students actually used computers, and they would do these kind of these traced overdraws, they would draw over it, and they would, with a kind of wobbly hand, kind of sketch things, pretending it was hand drawn. And they were the ones who did well. The ones who didn't do that, the ones who literally did not use the computer, they graduated and they were unemployable. they were simply, there was no place for them in the office because they couldn't use the basic tools that officers were using. So in some sense, we've got to engage with it. But in terms of winners and losers, I think this is really a question of kind of like, the architectural imagination, in sense like, I think the real challenge is not forms, but to imagine new ways of operating. I've got a graduate from FIU, super talented guy from Brazil, Matheus Bencati, who did an amazing project, won the thesis award, but then he became a kind of metaverse host. He has a platform where he hosts, medical conferences. He designs metaverse spaces for certain industries, for certain stores, for certain shops, for certain businesses, and so on. And that's the way we need to kind of use it, to think creatively about the possibilities. And I basically think unless we do that, if we just stand still, we'll be kind of left behind. That's a comment obviously made by ChatGPT. We need to do that. But I think the point is ultimately is that this is the point that's going to affect everyone in every discipline. You can shift it to something else, but you're going to find that same discipline there. And just one kind of final comment, which is not really related to your question as such, and that is to say, well, we can do certain things for sure. We can design fashion. I mean, pretty quickly, what I find strangely is you can use the same prompt and just change building and put in jewelry or handbag or fashion or whatever it was, and it will still generate this kind of gobsmacking, Paris catwalk of fashion, whatever. But the real question ultimately is you've got to be a connoisseur, you've got to know what is good, and you've got to understand what is appropriate. So myself as an architect, a naive architect, I'm not even sure which of the good ones I've generated. I have to go to my friends in the fashion and say, what are the good ones here? So in the end, it still presupposes in some senses that if you've got to have an eye for things, if they're used in this general, you've got to be able to discriminate, you've got to be able to judge it, and you've got to have some knowledge of the subject. So it doesn't mean it's a complete free-for-all at all. It is, but I think the point is to be open and critical about the possibilities of these technologies, and not just to accept them and blindly and say, wow, these are amazing, nor indeed to denigrate them, to dismiss them, but rather to be open to critically think and evaluate how we're going to use these, because the future is really ultimately not predictable in some sense. It's up to us to make our future. It's up to us architects to, in fact, to design our future. Maybe, Lorena, we can move on to your question. Do you want to ask your question, or yeah?
Happy to. Thank you for the lecture. Very thought-provoking. So I was curious about this subject of AI not being inherently good or evil, and really that it's the user of the tool who determines what it's being used for. And so just thinking on a larger scale, there's the copyright issues, there's almost the weaponizing issues. So do you foresee that there might be laws established by governments that enforce ethical behavior through both the training of the AI, so that it's maybe protecting humanity, and also the implementation?
No, absolutely. This was in fact what Martin was talking about last week, and the need for this government control. In fact, there's been, I think it was it last week, or there was the White House, the captains of AI industry got together, and unanimously they were concerned about this, although nobody seems to know how you're going to do it. But the real problem ultimately of this is, how do you police this? How do you ensure that it's you're actually you make it effective? I mean, this is a problem that the International Court of Human Justice has got. You've got this court; it is imposing rulings and so on, but there's no effective way of ensuring that these rules are being adhered to. You can't control this, and if we can't stop Vladimir Putin from attacking Ukraine, how are we going to stop Vladimir Putin from using slaughterbox and things in that war of Ukraine? Or how are we going to stop anyone using AI in a negative way? We can't. And that's the real issue, is that it's impossible to do that. And just saying it's the responsibility of governments to do that, which is what that open letter was all about, the future of life. Well, that's just deferring most responsibilities to the government. And I'm not so sure how effective that's going to be. I mean, we clearly need to be aware of this, but I'm not quite sure whether we can get there.
We need an AI to police the AI.
Sorry,
I said perhaps we need an AI that can police the AI to just keep up with it, because
that's the way you've got to think about it. I think that is precisely the way that you've got to think about it. I mean, I think that, for example, everyone's talking about. I mean, this is, maybe I've touched on this before, but everyone's talking about fakes, and of course there's a danger of fakes, and we know that, but I actually think that you could use AI to check that. I actually really think that it's going to be about everything we write is going to be fact checked, and every image is going to be source checked. And I think that you're absolutely right. I think we could use AI to precisely do that. Yeah, no, that's a good point.
Thank you.
We've got a question from Eric. Jerry, do you want to ask that? Make your comment. Maybe, I think it's more. I haven't seen. There's no question about that. Is it a comment or?
It's a comment, really, just picking up on the speculation about the early use of some of the AI visualization, imagination tools into the studio curriculum and whatnot. I'm still hesitant about it. I encourage it, that when I see it, I don't like it, because it also tends to homogenize things down to a sort of low standard base. But I was just saying here, I can read it, that there's something to be said about the incorporation of technology into the studios. And as just talking a little bit about the GSAP at Columbia, and how certain person was super instrumental in allowing this, as you could be instrumental now, Neil, in a more global scale. But back then, I guess some people were really interested in exploring the capacities of co-opting certain software and techniques that were especially being used in the cinematography, and then co-opted these software, such as initially primitive stuff like Form Z, and then way more sophisticated studio tools, and Maya as a derivative of studio tools that then got further and further incorporated into the curriculum. And for that to happen, though, it was necessary at the time, picking up also on your comment about computers. But at the time, and actually I worked for Hani Rashid later on too, and he had in an armoire the old Silicon graphics that Shumi had paid like $50,000 per unit for each one computer, so that Hani, Greg, and people like Lars Spoiberg and other people, even Carl Chu back then, a little later on. So I was a student there at Columbia, and I had Greg Lynn as a professor, and other people like that, Evan Douglas, and it was kind of like seeing kind of wilderness, right, that you're talking about now, Neil, back for those times. And I was there 2001 and 2. This thing had been going on years before. And Mandias Alonso was there before me, and then we taught together at Columbia. But the point is that I think that this is running rampant, right? And it should be let run rampant. And it was also the comment back then that other people, very conservative people, I don't want to sound like one now, but saying that you really just created, it seemed like, oh, it was designed by Maya. It wasn't designed by somebody. That was because people did not know the nuances and attenuations and the kind of like really radical different ways that you could operate within the constraints of the tool, so that the techniques that are embedded and the algorithms that are embedded within the software, it allowed you to work with it as a partner. So as long as you knew it was a partner, and a lot of what you were being done, it was possible because of it. And how do you then customize? How do you then how do you acquire a personality? And how do you then not become instrumentalized by the instrument? And I think that these are, I think that I was also saying there, I miswrite something, but I was employed also by Eisenman right after Columbia at that time. And I thought Eisenman had been doing this bringing the alien to the logic of design and academia, at least since the mid-80s, much earlier if you look at his houses as they're codified and they're generating a codex. But I think that my question is, how do we begin to pair a kind of a more sophisticated conceptual discourse about these things with the implementation of the tools? If not, we're just Charlie Parker and say, learning to telling himself how to play certain notes that are producing amazing bebop. But we can, what I'm missing is the sort of like pairing of an armature of conceptual critical reception of these things with the use in studio.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's an open question that I think, quite how it impacts on the studio. I mean, I think we haven't seen the full impact, yet. I think that Midjourney is just, had its first birthday, and I think next year we're going to see it in the studio. And I don't know how you're going to teach studio, frankly. I don't know how it's going to be taught. Just as I don't know how you're going to write essays with ChatGPT. It's going to be a challenge. I mean, the only way you can recognize an essay by ChatGPT is if the spelling and the grammar is perfectly accurate. So there's, that remains an open sort of question. And I think that the other question you kind of allude to in some sense is that in some ways there's been a fetishization of the technology itself. This is a tool. To my mind, ultimately it's a question of how you use that tool for the benefit of humanity. And that means kind of engaging with social, political, and economic issues. So it's not just about the tool itself, but you're actually trying to change the world. But Shumi himself is a fascinating character and a catalyst, shall we say, of things. And if you think about him, well, first of all, let's compare him to Rem Koolhaas. So those guys back in the 90s, Shumi had won this competition for Parc de la Villette, and some people thought that maybe OMA Rem should have won that competition. I don't know who should have done, but anyway, Shumi did. Now, Shumi and Rem have had very different careers. Rem avoided academia, he took on a few visiting posts, but basically ran his practice. Shumi, in fact, obviously kept his practice going, but really invested in academia. And I think that maybe history will tell us that, in fact, Shumi's contribution to architecture could have been even greater than Rem's because of what he did at Columbia at that particular time. In other words, he offered us a model of how architecture go forward. He actually took the model from the AA. He taught at the AA beforehand, and the unit model and so on was all transferred to Columbia. But he was extremely sharp at recognizing new ideas, new characters, new technologies, new theories, and just bringing them on board. I mean, he employed me. I was like a super young person then to come and teach in this kind of perfect storm, this melting pot that he put together there. And it was an incredible assembly of super talented people, all of whom have gone on to do other things. If you look at Evan Douglas is being the dean of RPI, and so on and so on. And it arguably could be said that his presence, a bit like Alvin Boyarsky at the AA before him, was really one of the most important parts of architectural culture. And Alvin was an absolute genius. And if you think about it, what was going on at the AA? We all know that Rem studied there, and he taught Zaha, and these people were there, that John Fraser and Gordon Pascoe, all these individuals, and Cedric Price. It was an incredible thing, but they were only there because of Alvin Boyarsky. And likewise at Columbia, it was Bernard who saw this possibility and was truly a visionary. Now, what was interesting in some senses, he brought with him, there are two things that basically I see Bernard responsible for. One was the introduction of French thinking from May 68, Derrida, and so on. That kind of petered out, right? It didn't really filter run, but the technology thing that he invested in was hugely significant. And I look at those people who went through and what happened to them. So I just think that history might look at Bernard and say this person was one of the most crucial catalysts, shall we say, of architectural culture, because he recognized these things. Back in the early 90s, he had paperless studios. I mean, I still see, I say where, but you know very well what I mean, people pinning up drawings onto walls these days. I still see that, and yet, he was what he was talking about was so prescient. I mean, part of the problem, of course, was the question of cost. I mean, it was so expensive to do all these things. And Mamel Delando, of course, was also teaching there. He was the one, Bernard was the one that brought Delando in, and said that in order to buy an ordinary computer, they said, you have to invest the family fortune into it. Well, one of the points about Moore's law is not only do things get faster and faster, but the prices come down by half. And now, frankly, despite inflation, the cost of a laptop is pretty much the same as the first cost of my first computer, and it's way, way more powerful. So yeah, but no, I think he's a he's an interesting figure to think through. I mean, I am enormously impressed by Bernard, enormously impressed. I can't say any more than that, but he was a catalyst. He really did something incredible.
It's funny you're saying he was a catalyst, and I thought at the beginning you said he's a capitalist.
Oh no.
To say in the same sentence, but you know what? I think that what I was referring to is exactly that point that you made, where he really introduced French thought. If you were to Columbia in the late 90s, early 2000s, you had to read 1,000 Plateaus before you went to Columbia, Deleuze and Guattari, and other things like that. And I also definitely enjoyed having 2 seminars by Manuel de Landa there. So my greatest like to the time being in a place like that was that it wasn't about the tools, it wasn't about the techniques. Yes, you crave that. But the moment you got in there was a whole apparatus of theory that it may have petered out, as you say. I don't think it quite have. But what happened is Mark Wigley came in to dilapidate and disassemble everything. And you got Stan Allen in Princeton, you got Alejandro in Princeton, and what have you, Jesse Reiser, a lot of these people everywhere else. Evan became a chair at Pratt, and I was hired by him at Pratt too. But anyways, I don't want to, there's a lot of stuff there. I don't want to distract. Thank you, Nick.
No, well, okay, we're just going back to the question. Okay, actually, Mark Wigley, I was there when there was a fight to bring Mark Wigley in, and what's his name, Bell from Rice came in at the same time, and it was a kind of like a deal.
Sanford Quinter.
No, not Sanford. It was a guy, a designer from Michael Bell, and there was a battle going on between Kenneth Frampton and Bernard. Bernard trying to push things forward, and this rearguard action by Kenneth Frampton. And as I recall, and maybe I'm speaking out of turn here, but it was really a compromise that so Schumi fought to bring in Wigley, and gave Frampton's concession Michael Bell to bring in, and that was the way it happened. But of course, you're right; he actually undid much of the legacy of Schumi, which I think is regrettable. But just to go back to this kind of question about, I think in the end, the real lesson about from Derrida and deconstruction and all that kind of thing is a lesson of questioning, challenging the assumptions in a certain inherited traditions, and that's precisely, I think, the thing that really came out, and challenging the way that we do things in the architectural studio. And that, in some sense, so maybe I'll go backtrack and say, well, maybe the theoretical side of things wasn't so important. I think maybe it was absolutely the most important, you could say, because it was the basis of challenging how we produce architecture, whether it's paperless studios, whether it's use of the computer or whatever else. It was questioning everything, questioning tradition, and trying to, frankly, overcome some of the biases implicit in things. So I think that yeah, it was probably very important. We have the opportunity for any other questions. Either can we just check on YouTube whether there are any others or
Neil.
Yeah.
Is it okay that I ask my question?
No, go ahead. Oh, did you have a question? I didn't notice it. Sorry, my apologies.
Oh, no. Sorry, Neil. Just wanted to ask briefly, now that AI seems to be ubiquitous in different locations of research at the university and in some curriculum. So going from architecture to the fine arts to the media arts to even philosophy and the humanities. How do you actually see the responsibility of authors and primary researchers to disseminate some of this educational foresight in curriculum?
Well, I difficult to say anything in general, but I just think that it's a tool, and I mean, and any tool has its affordances and allows us to do certain things and redefine what things are. I mean, I think that you can just see how, for example, Google has been so significant, and actually, if you're in a country like China where Google's banned, it is almost impossible to operate. We do this searching technique. which is astonishing. It can actually literally, and eventually what Google's aiming towards is going to give you the answer, right? So it's going to be making more compromised because you're going to get absolutely everything from Google. So those kind of things that they open up new ways of operating, new techniques, new strategies. I think that the really the smart people are the ones who are alert to those possibilities, can incorporate those tools and exploit the potential of those tools in new and interesting ways. And I think that therefore the one key question is adaptation and how we adapt to a tool that itself is adapting and changing quicker than ever we could. And that seems to me that the real challenge. How do we adapt? And I would simply sort of say, this is a story that I often tell. There was a one professor who was, when young, was super popular, and the lecture halls were always packed out. And then towards the end of his career, there were 6 people in the front row, and that was it. And he was puzzled as to why there were so few people there. And he said, but I've been teaching exactly the same material that I have in the past. Well, that's the point. We need to change and adapt in ways, and it's not just necessarily the question of AI itself that needs to be brought on board. I mean, just to go back to the question about Bernard Shunny and how he was questioning how things should operate, how paperless studios and all these kind of things. And I think we need to really interrogate the world of education, because I think nobody's questioned that. It's carried on. It took, actually, frankly, the pandemic to jolt us out of our familiar routines and to launch things like Digital Futures as a global educational platform. That wouldn't have happened without the pandemic. We would have been carried on doing the same thing as we did in the past. I think we need to be more proactive in envisioning possibilities, and not just relying on these emergencies like the pandemic to force us to change. So I'm not sure what the answer is, except to be that we need to be alert to the possibilities of how we can exploit this thing. I mean, and it was like I remember back my first ever conference, which I organized on computation, which was back in the RIBA in, was it 2001, 2002? I forget. It was called eFutures. And we had a guy called Douglas Rushkoff, who was basically he was famous. He's a kind of cultural commentator from New York, super inspiring author. And he wrote a book called Children of Chaos. And he was commenting about, how we need to adapt and change in our world. And that, you will get, for example, Prince Charles, or King Charles as it was then, who he is now, but in the old days he was very conservative about how, maybe he is still, how we'd approach certain things. And he was critical about modern architecture, critical about a lot of different things. And what, it's very easy to take that viewpoint, that the world we know is changing, and we fall back on what we know, and we criticize these new things, And he would say, look, well, but the problem is this: you can criticize the kids of today. We can criticize them because they can't spell, they can't add up. They're a kind of Beavis and Butter generation of distracted television viewers. And he said, well, hold on a second. We don't need to spell because we've got spell check. We don't need to add up. We've got this thing. And frankly, now we've got ChatGPT. So let's take that on board as well. And it's important to recognize the new skills that this new generation has, multitasking, that frankly is invisible to Charles. He wasn't part of the multitasking generation. So we need to adapt and think through creatively how we should be operating in a world, an horizon, which frankly is changing on an absolute day-by-day basis. So, I think that's the point. Is there's no kind of particular kind of recommendation I have, except to say let's be alert to these possibilities, incorporate these tools, and investigate how we can use them for the benefit of humanity. This goes back to this comment by Douglas Rushkoff. Everybody thought that kind of like the internet would be suddenly democratizing everything. In fact, what we got was spam. That's what we got, first of all. We need to work out how we can overcome that and exploit the potential of it. So in other words, and unless we engage with those things, we're not going to be able to do that. We're just going to leave it up to someone else. So we need to be proactive, all of us, in trying to explore how we use these tools. That's my view anyway. I don't know if that's other people share that, but we have to adapt and think creatively, because and very quickly, because the world is changing so rapidly.
Neil, I wanted to follow up real briefly.
Yeah.
With the advent of architecture and AI, and actually the way that it seems as though architecture is moving into kind of a STEM funding framework, how can architects and policymakers and government come together so that we can use the power of our education at a basic research level? Like, what can AI do for design, kind of the human in space and the interface? Like, how can we make a better, more humane living world if we don't have the proper funding to do basic research and to build on knowledge? What are your thoughts about us coming together and the leaders currently in the field to make that happen?
Well, I don't know. I mean, if you rethink the system, I mean, one of the things that Digital Futures is trying to do is to rethink the system, whereby you step outside of that kind of grabbing money logic and think, well, how can we share our passion for architecture? And it proved to be effective. Basically, people are willing to share that, and that has a benefit for everyone. So it's not necessarily a question of kind of necessarily grabbing money for these things. And it is, frankly, it is challenging to write grants, and some people are very, very good at writing grants and getting grants, and other people not so much so. So I'm not sure the answer to your question. I think we have to just be alert to all those possibilities. But in the end, I think the key question is, how do you make society better? That has got to be the role, I think, of architects in general, and the way in which we use AI. We use it for the benefit of the society, and it's not just a fetishized tool. It goes beyond that. So I don't know. I'm not sure what your view is, Gustavo, and how you would suggest this, but I think it's just, yeah. Do you have a view on that, or you?
Well, I guess what I wanted to say is that I think a lot of the young, let's say, researchers or associate professors, they're caught in this dilemma where they're in the system and they have to follow it and can't disturb it so much to get some sort of financial stability in their research or to get a foothold in their business. But I think that at some level, we're compromised as researchers trying to build on knowledge, or intellectuals in the field. We're always chasing and searching for funding or for stability. So I'm asking you, as a luminary in the field, your choices in looking at creating a Digital Futures platform is one component, but how do we actually form a stronger bond with research and with funding so that we can have more intellectual freedom?
Well, but I think the question of freedom goes beyond that, in the sense that, we actually have on this chat today, we have Vasco and Deepti, who are both students of mine in Dessau, or maybe I was students of them, actually. And what I discovered when I was working in a place like Dessau, which is interesting, the Dessau Institute of Architecture, right by the Bauhaus, right in the shadow of the Bauhaus, was that we got people there who got offered places at Harvard and AA and so on, couldn't afford to go there because they came from poorer countries. Bangladesh, nobody could afford to go anywhere. So, and what I discovered was that the talent was universal throughout the world. There are countries like Macedonia, we never heard of, but they're super talented individuals. And really, the challenge was not so much as how those in wealthy communities could make more money and get more research grants, but rather an ethical one about how we could share resources around the world. And we've seen that the world is not equal, that COVID vaccinations, there were no vaccinations apart from the elite, for the elite in countries like Iran. There were no vaccinations. The world is not equal. The people in other countries simply cannot pay for things. Ahmed from our Digital Futures team was offered a place at Harvard. They were given a 50% scholarship. And he said, well, how do I pay for the other 50%? And I think this is the real concern. It's not necessarily about elite institutions in the West making yet more money from elite companies in the West, but rather, how do we share those resources to make the world more equal? Because it's not equal, and that's, to my mind, the really important thing is to harness the possibility of these technologies to really to make the world a better place. And that's maybe I'm an old-fashioned European socialist and I kind of believe in these things and they're out of date, but I think that's a noble concern, and that's really what's behind digital, but my impression of the digital futures. But of course, you've got to knowingly tap in to those sources and share those things. In the UK, we had famously Robin Hood, who was able to, I always think that they moved, when I was in Nottingham, they moved the tax offices to Nottingham, which is where Robin Hood comes from. And I thought that was great. Robin Hood robbed from the rich to give to the poor, which is kind of somehow a noble occupation, is what tax is about. But if we can work within an economic system and try to find a way to take those resources and share them around the world, that, to my mind, is a much more noble gesture than simply getting more grants for already privileged individuals. But maybe I'm a bit remote in that. But
no, Neil, thank you very much. I love hearing your thoughts, and I think that I'm one of that generation that's a little lost, that sees that my elders have fought 30 to 40 years in the academic and research system, but I'm looking for some guidance or a vision to try to make the world a better place. So thank you very much, Neil.
Yeah, no, I think, if in terms of digital futures, if ever we get the position whereby we can support a platform that can offer a free masters, the way that Ahmed Hassab is talking, that would be an incredible gesture to those people in countries. He comes from Egypt, and there are some very, very smart people coming from Egypt who have always had to struggle against that. Mo Gawdat being another example, Ayariyad and so on. Very, very smart individuals. So, I think that's the issue ultimately is not the fetishization of technology, nor indeed the exploitation of finances, but rather the way in which we can use both the economic system, and technology to benefit humanity as a whole. And I think there are there's one basic problem right now, is that we have people who either celebrate capitalism as being the answer to everything, and Patrik, much as I respect him, that's his view, or we have people who denigrate capitalism. And so in the end, it is just a system. How do we use this to benefit humanity? How do we use these tools to benefit humanity? They are not in and of themselves either good or bad. So that's the real question: is how do we make the world better? And I think that's what the role of the architect is. Not about making buildings, but trying to imagine. And I mean by that, imagine beyond straight architecture, how we make a world a better place. And let's not forget that TED Talks, they were developed by an architect who had a sense of how we could make this work together. So to my mind, maybe the role of architecture is to think at that level, to think how we can make this world more equitable. We can share knowledge, we can improve it by harnessing resources in an intelligent way. So that's, to my mind, that's a form of architecture.
Well, thank you, Neil. That was, I just wanted to say, yeah, thank you also to Eric for those a few anecdotes from Colombia. Very interesting to hear. And just the last remarks you made, Neil, I think they're really really important and wonderful. I mean, we should also maybe recall that Geoffrey Hinton, who you brought up several times, has said, to the best of my knowledge, has said that we need AI in socialism. He said that, and so that just speaks, I think, to what you just said, Neil. Right? Is it also this question of automation and the fear of being replaced or of replacement? I mean, Bratton has argued that automation is intrinsically connected to the history of humanity. Basically, we've all been automating all along, and in a sense, if we go back to Marx, right, already in the Grundrisse, Marx in the Fragment on Machines, Marx saw that. He thought that that machines could provide for a certain liberation, right, from being forced to work forever, how many hours per day. So in a sense, automation, and as much as it of course raises questions and problems, is something that within an appropriate system can be of enormous benefit. So I think So I think the framework that we have, that we are scared and frightened of being replaced, sure, if that means we're going to be unemployed and out of money and we're going to be starving, that's something to be afraid of. But because it means that going back to Hinton, in a sense, is that AI may also ask of us to a certain extent revise or rethink or design is something that we do, right? The economic system that we are that we want to that we have to, in a sense, I think we're going to be actually forced to do that, right? So I think these are enormously important and super interesting questions, and I think that we as artists, designers, architects should and will have to play an important role in that as well. Yeah, I'll leave it there, but I think these are wonderfully complex and important questions that AI actually is asking of us in a certain way.
Yeah. No, I mean, let me just say that Hinton is someone I admire enormously, not just because of his contributions to AI, but his ethical stance, right? He was, I mean, goes back in some way to the question about Gustavo, this money is there to come in, but where is the source of all these things? And what Hinton, I mean, it wasn't just simply that he was worried about the military funding of research in the States, but he was horrified by some of the examples. He gives the example of a self-healing minefield. In other words, a minefield that has been disrupted that would heal itself. And it was just, it went against his whole humanitarian outlook to even conceive of that. And I think that's ultimately the whole question. But in the end, I think what we are going to face, just to say, it's not about the technology, it's about the applications, the social, economic, and political applications of technology to make the world a better place. I'm absolutely convinced of that. But it's also throwing up, this really important question, which, I will just, maybe we can just leave it, we can stop, hold it, and leave this as a question. What is going to happen in the future in a world without work? Now, as Mustafa Suleyman said, well, actually, we don't really always want to work. We've constructed a world in which we get identity from work, but what if we, to renegotiate that, and we're not obliged to, how can we work productively within that system? That's a kind of sociological question in the first place. But there's also another question, which is a socio-economic political question, which say, well, you're going to have some kind of model, let's say universal basic income or something, that's going to be able to step in there to provide some safety net. Now, in Europe, we have that. We have effectively, I think Marx was not referring to third world. He was talking about advanced capitalist societies in some sense. And effectively, I think Europe is actually manifestation of exactly what he was talking about, and maybe there are some countries in some sense more advanced than others. I think the model in Germany of not quite totally free, but almost free education, the model in the UK of the National Health Service, which frankly is actually a much better system as well as being free, because they're not obliged to come up with an immediate answer that is accountable to the accountants. They can take their time to think through a problem and solve it. And I can tell you from personal experience, that's exactly what happened. I was able to get much better medical care in the UK because of that. These are some of the issues that we need to deal with. And it's going to be a problem in the States in particular, where the word socialism is somehow, has got a stain to it. And there's this kind of knee-jerk reaction, partly as a result of the Cold War and so on. How are we able to engage with a kind of universal basic income and all those kind of systems in our cultures? This is going to go way beyond the technology, way beyond the issues of capitalism per se, into another territory. And we need to be prepared for that, because that's what we'll need to do. That's what we need to do. Mikhail, we're coming up to the end. We're coming to 2.5 hours. Let's wrap it up here, because this is a conversation I think that's going to go on more. Next week, we're going to be talking about an article that was put together on generative AI, which is an incredible article. And the following week, we'll be looking at the kind of issues of copyright. And then we have Blaise Aguirre-Arcos. So this is, I think, a debate that is going to go on. And beyond this particular series, I think it's important to address these questions, to address these in a kind of an informed and open-minded way, where we're not just being opinionated, but we're able to to really listen to and understand the world as it is and come up with intelligent responses. Can I just say, I want to just thank the team behind this. I just think the whole Digital Futures project is incredible and is really a remarkable manifestation of humanity, how people are willing to not be selfish, but to contribute in some way, to share knowledge and share understanding. And I just want to thank those behind it, including you, Michal, and others who are part of this project to make this place work. And I'm hoping that this will have an impact eventually that will spread and spread and spread. So thank you so much. And thank you those who joined us. And this will be uploaded to the YouTube channel. Let's keep an open mind and think about how we can make the world a better place through technology and through the use of capitalism. Thank you for all the comments here, and see you next week. And just to say also, just finally, on Saturdays, we are running a series of tutorials. If this was about the Black Mirror side of AI, there's also another side, which is about how you use AI in a very instructive way. And yesterday I had a session, which is uploaded to the YouTube channel, showing you how to get started on Midjourney. Thank you, everybody, and see you all next week. Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you, Neil. Thank you, everyone. Wonderful.
Okay.